Hi, David. How are you? Nice to see you. Congratulations. You made this all possible, right?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp, and President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And I'm just hugely pleased to see you here tonight, also to our online audience. This project started through a series of conversations that I had with Peter Ackerman, where Peter is one of the smartest people I know on this set of issues, and one of the most provocative thinkers on democracy and nonviolent resistance. And we were sitting at a breakfast, I will remember for a long time, where we were just brainstorming. And I can't remember who came up with this idea first, but we were talking about thank you for that credit. But we were talking about the future of democracy, and it's not that we don't all care about the future of democracy, but a lot of people are talking about it, and a lot of people are thinking about democracy promotion. A lot of people are thinking about advocacy around democracy, but we started talking about what about the future of tyranny? Not enough people are talking about what kind of future tyrants have? What kind of methods are they using? Does technology favor them, or does it favor Democrats, small d? So this is now called the future of authoritarianism, but it started in talking about the future of tyranny. And I thought I was just really taken with the conversation, and also this feeding out of the work that we did with the National Intelligence Council before with Matt Burrows, who we hired about 30 seconds after he stepped down from the National Intelligence Council to run our Strategic Foresight Initiative. part of what we were looking about that period of time, and there was a vibrant discussion when you got into people who knew technology most, is who was it really going to favor? And coming from the Wall Street Journal and journalism, I just assumed, well, technology and individual empowerment, the rise of the middle class, all the things we were talking about, have to favor democracy, have to favor everything we've seen before, but it isn't necessarily that case. Authoritarians are adapting to the 21st century, censoring news and information flows, manipulating norms established and protected by IGOs and more. The Council's been following flashpoints around the world in the last few years to understand the shifts in governance and determine how these changes impact international security. But of all the work we're doing, I really think that this kind of galvanizes this whole notion of what's the future of authoritarianism, led by Matt Burrows, the Council Strategic Foresight and the Council Strategic Foresight Initiative, and then Senior Fellow Maria Stepan, housed in the Brent Scowcroft Center for International Security, and very much inspired by Peter. So tonight we recognize the culmination of a year's work on this project. The release of the book is Authoritarianism Staging a Comeback. You know, I'm not one of the panelists, but let me just answer, yes, it is. and then we'll talk to them about how lasting is it, what's behind it, and what do we do about it. This volume of essays, leading experts in the field, centered on civil resistance, democratic transitions, sanctions, adaptable authoritarians, the role of armed forces in transitions, and more. So this is just a great book. You'll hear about it more in the next panel. But just looking on page 4, if you look at this, the past 8 years have been the longest stretch of reported deterioration in democracy since Freedom House began tracking these issues in 1972. So the march of democracy is met with a wall of resistance in 3 major settings: China, Eurasia, and most of the Middle East. And so the question raised in this introduction is, are the past 8 years a blip or a new trend setter? And what Matt says here is, my work on global trends and National Intelligence Council would suggest both good and bad news on that score. On the good news, increasing broad consensus about the legitimacy, at least in principle, of liberal democracy. We live in the most democratic and least authoritarian world in the history of the modern state system. But then we talk about the downsides of that as well. So at that point, I want to pass to this incredible panel. We've got Damon Wilson and Peter Ackerman and Paula Dobriansky on stage with me to discuss how the project came to be and help us understand where we need to go next. We don't see this as the end of our work. We see this actually as the beginning of our work, and then where do we take it next as well. Let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll get right into it. Damon's been leading the Council's programming as Executive Vice President, and this project, as any of you know Damon, is very close to his interests and his passions, as he's championed strong transatlantic ties and global norms. And if you've been watching at all our work on Ukraine, which I think has really been the leading work in this town, he's been very much behind that with Ambassador John Herbst and his team. Peter Ackerman is founding chair of the International Center of Nonviolent Conflict. I think I've already introduced you. Other than that, really one of the leading thinkers on this set of issues. And then Paula Dobriansky, Ambassador Dobriansky, senior fellow on the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard's Belfer Center. And Paula, along with Peter, are members of our board. Paula's executive committee member of our board, and long-standing advocates, both of them, for peaceful democratic transitions around the world. This panel will be followed by a discussion with a few of the esteemed authors: George Lopez from USIP, Admiral Dennis Blair, whose handbook, what was the title of your handbook? The handbook for military engagement. This is one of the best reads you could ever turn to in this set of issues. And so it would be great to have him on the panel, and then Regine Spector. And then, most important, of course, the wine and cheese reception in the lobby afterwards. So let me encourage you all to engage in the event online using the hashtag ACDisrupt, so ACDisrupt, and to tweet at AC Foresight. So why don't I start with Peter and just give us a little bit of an idea of what you saw this, what you wanted out of this, and what do you think are the most important?
Sure. Many thanks to the Atlantic Council and Fred and Damon for having me here and working with you, and good to see you, Paula. I think your answer is authoritarianism staging a comeback? Obviously, yes. The more interesting question is, can it sustain its comeback? And if you ask that question from the perspective of an authoritarian, he would answer the question with a question, and that would be, I can sustain my comeback as long as there isn't a viable civil resistance to thwart my continuing authoritarian repression. So let's talk about what that is, and for a second or two, sort of clear that path, and then we can use that as a basis for a conversation. So civil resistance is what people do when they're living under oppression. It could be many, many different forms. We've seen them all. And they have no viable military option to deal with that oppression, so they use strikes and boycotts and mass protests to basically try to undermine the cohesion of the authoritarian superstructure that controls them and basically lead to a different kind of governance at the end of the day. Now, just for a minute or two, having been working on this subject now for almost 4 decades, I'd like to clear the underbrush that usually is still here for 4 decades in terms of definitions. When we talk about civil resistance, we're not talking about nonviolence or pacifism in the sense that it's a moral act that people should be nonviolent per se, because as a matter of fact, most of the movements that have been led by nonviolent resistance movements that have been led in the last 4 decades have been led by people who, if they thought they had a viable military option, they would have used it. It's not a form of negotiation. Negotiation is the end product of this kind of clash of wills between the authoritarian and the citizen. And it's not, as the authoritarians have been trying to declare, to basically undermine an effort by the West to understand the phenomenon. It's not really regime change. It's really a press back against the worst elements of authoritarian governance, and a regime doesn't necessarily have to change. It could also negotiate its way into a more democratic result. Now, there's been also a series of misperceptions about the subject. One, that it is spontaneous. It just sort of happens. It comes from nowhere, and when it fails, it goes back to nowhere, and it's something that can't be planned, predicted, or affected in any way. It also is believed to be something that is limited by conditions. So if you're poor, if you have ethnic problems, if the authoritarian is too brutal, all these things make it impossible for civil resistance to work. And we've done good work, both Maria and we've done work at Freedom House when I was the chairman there, showing that there's no correlation between these limiting conditions and the outcome of a civil resistance movement. But if you think about how policymakers think about the Green Revolution or what happened in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution in 2004, and now its latest configuration, manifestation, they have trouble understanding how they can affect these events from a policy point of view, or whether they even want to. Because if we look what happened in the Middle East, the Arab Spring started as a civil resistance, and now we're not sure what it is and why did it go awry in many states. So the evolution of the concept of civil resistance really started with my mentor, Gene Sharp, when he wrote a book called The Politics of Nonviolent Action, where he basically said, and repeating Etienne de la Boétie's notion, that people can't be governed if they won't obey. And he wrote 3 volumes on that, and he had 198 different kinds of methods about how you disobey. You should take a look at them. They're interesting, very useful today. But what it didn't do is it didn't get into the question of, well, there's a cost to being disobeyed if you're an authoritarian, but there's also a cost to disobeying if you're a member of civil society. So if you remember the boycotts that were in Venezuela with Chavez in the early years, the Democrats thought that they could win, but the boycotts were so costly to their own economy that ultimately Chavez outlasted them. So the cost to the civil resistor for a certain kind of tactic was greater for them than it was for the authoritarian, and they didn't succeed. In 1967, I think a man that we all revere, in fact, maybe the second coming of the Christ, Thomas Schelling, wrote the
we all have our own religions.
That's right. But if we're sitting here, he might be one of the ones that we'd listen to probably pretty carefully. He wrote an amazing volume in 1967 that was edited by Adam Roberts, who was now the He was then the head of the International Relations Department in Oxford. In a book called Civil Resistance as a National Defense, he wrote an article called Thoughts on Civil Resistance. And in it, he wrote the following: "The tyrant and his subjects are in somewhat symmetrical positions. They can deny him most of what he wants. They can, that is, if they have the disciplined organization to refuse collaboration. And he can deny them just about everything they want. He can deny it by using the force at his command. They can confront him with chaos, starvation, idleness, and social breakdown, but he confronts them with the same thing. And indeed, most of what they deny him, they deny themselves." And here's the key. "It is a bargaining situation in which either side, if adequately disciplined and organized, can deny most of what the other wants, and it remains to see who wins." Now, what he's basically saying is that we have to go beyond the fact that there's a cost to being disobeyed and a cost to disobey, but think about what it means to be disciplined and organized. What does it mean to basically improve your chances of winning by using skills? What happens if skills become more important in consideration of the outcome, skills by civil society, and also skills by the authoritarian to counter civil society? Who wins that battle? Well, he said in 1967, and remains true today, it remains to see who wins. So whereas we've been very disappointed by the fact that authoritarians have undone successful pro-democracy movements and the advances in democracy, we shouldn't assume that because authoritarians are for this moment successful, that there isn't a counter to their counter. So I think as a matter of policy, we have to be thinking very carefully about what is skillful civil resistance and what is skillful counter-authoritarian moves. And once we get to understand that, we might have a good understanding as well about what kind of policies we should have to help civil resistors in their quest to create a more democratic society as a part of a conflict. Now, let me just step back and be a little more specific. The main differentiating factor between a civil resistance and a violent insurrection is that a violent insurrection relies on military means. They rely on violence. The idea basically, usually, in its crudest sense, is 5,000 or 10,000 highly athletic young men intercede between the population and the authoritarian. They try to shoot their way to the top, and having done so, they basically create a change in regime. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that in many cases when that works, and Maria Stefan, who is there, will tell you about the amazing work she's done with Erica Chenoweth about cataloging the probability of that occurring versus a civil resistance. But the main problem with that is that since a small number of people are affecting that change, there's very little cooperation within civil society as a part of that transition, and it very rarely leads to democracy. A civil resistance, on the other hand, exploits what Natan Sharansky calls the latent double thinkers. The people who are not equally loyal within an authoritarian regime, and through the disruptions that are nonviolent but disruptive, basically allows the potential double thinkers to discover that they think the same way and to organize and to create additional pressure on the authoritarian. So what I think we should be talking about if we're really interested in thinking about civil resistance, and we should be, because if you ask today in the two worst places we're involved in, or the most difficult, which is in Russia and in Iran, you ask them, well, what are they most afraid of? And right now it's not American military power. It's a civil resistance within their own society that they can't control. It's a wholesale loss of loyalty by major elements within the society that they can't control. This is what happened in Ukraine, and it's what happened for a short period of time in Iran. If we start with the idea that these are events that can be reproducible, they can be helped and assisted, then what we have is a very important policy tool, not for regime change, but to basically look and analyze what the prospect of that sort of thing succeeding within these societies might be. And we have a huge stake in whether they do or they don't. If we don't believe that, one of the justifications for the Iran deal that's been articulated by the president is that, look, if we wait 10 years and hold it back, society might change and, we will have a better result 10 years from now. Well, the only way society is going to change if civil society confronts the IRGC. That's the only way it's going to happen, one way or another. Either the IRGC melts or defects or they don't, and that will determine, I think, pretty much what the next 10 years is going to look like. So we have a stake in that. So in the book, and I'll conclude now, in the book, Hardy Merriman and I wrote an article called The Checklist to End Tyranny. And what we're trying to do is address a phenomenon that a man named Atul Gawande confronted in a book called The Checklist Manifesto, when he worked in trauma wards of major hospitals, and people came in badly injured. And if you look at the problem he had, it was life-threatening, it was very time-sensitive, and the wounds were very confusing to deal with. So what he did is he took his people off-site, and they said, let's pick 5 to 9 things that we must actually do or make sure we don't do, and see if we use that as a framework for our action and see what would happen. What he discovered was the amount of the results in terms of saving people, mitigating their injuries was extraordinary. And this, he wrote a book and he showed how this was done in other fields. And so when we work with dissidents at ICNC, the first thing they want to do is they want to know, well, what can we do to win? Because that's the question that's asked of us. And so what we're trying to do through this article and then a book I'm writing is to say, well, I'm going to ask you 6 or 7 questions, and let's see how you answer them, because that's the checklist. And in the book, there's a discussion of the checklist. I would ask you to take a look at it. But by understanding what the checklist is, it also gives us a framework to see how we can help these movements. Some of the elements of the checklist, for example, are, have you unified around leaders and goals? Have you the capacity to plan? Is your participation, public participation, growing? Are you actively trying to solicit defections? That sort of thing. And so I think I'll stop here and let others talk, but that's basically what this work has been about.
One question. I think
Sure.
this chapter is very, and then I'll go on to the other panels. Very important. The checklist is very important. Give me a feeling, if you're looking at the learning curve for authoritarians versus the learning curve of the quote-unquote good guys, are the authoritarians learning from each other, and can you point to specifics that makes us feel an Assad has learned from a Gaddafi or a Putin has learned from someone else? And then on the other side, is it happening in civil society?
I'd say that from 5 years back to 5 years back, so the start of the pushback, and Maria, maybe you'd like to comment on this, there's been some very active collaboration amongst authoritarians to basically share best practices. But that only goes so far. You know, we can do the same on the other side. And we sure should be in the game.
But are we?
I would say that there's a myopia in the policy community because they think these movements, as I said, are spontaneous, that we can't affect them, that we can't help them, and by the way, and we shouldn't rely on the policy implications of that help. And I think that one of the things we're trying to do together is to push against that and say, yeah, if we understand what it takes to win, what the competition is, what the authoritarians' greatest vulnerabilities are, and we get over this regime change inhibition, which has only served to help Putin and his ilk, then maybe we could scientifically more clearly look at what we can do. What can we do, for example, to help people come together and unify around democratically related goals and principles? Can we give them safe places to plan? Can we help them understand what planning means? Can we talk to them about targeting potential sources of defection? Denny Blair is, there's the guy, I mean, it's most often found in the military. Speak to Denny. So there's a lot we can do that we just have seen no point in doing because we don't really understand the phenomenon, and I think the point of our exercise together is to push back against that. If we look at this phenomenon as a skills-based activity, because the authoritarians definitely do, why would they be collaborating if they didn't think it was a skills-based activity for them? And so if we look at this as a skills-based activity, then suddenly we have all sorts of vistas of policy opportunities that we didn't see before.
So we look forward to hearing from you on that second panel, but I think this is a key question. I'll start, Paula, I'm sure you have some general comments on this subject, but perhaps you can also pick up on that is, are the authoritarians learning faster than their opponents? And is that part of the reason why we're seeing the trends that we've seen over the last period of time?
Well, let me maybe make a few general comments first and then go to that. First, I do want to congratulate the Atlantic Council. I want to congratulate Peter, Matt, Maria, the whole team, the contributors. It really is, this is an excellent product. And I want to just open by saying a few words from having been a practitioner. Because when I had the good fortune of looking at the draft prior to this, I said to myself, for those in government, this is an outstanding handbook in of itself. It's a monograph, but each and every chapter has an important message. There's the analysis, which, by the way, this particular analysis has not been done. I could be corrected with the National Intelligence Council, but I don't believe so. It hasn't been done. But secondly, it doesn't leave you there in terms of examining the trends and the analytical implications as to what this means and how it has bearing on policy, but it then moves into what are the practical steps that could be taken, particularly in understanding the toolkit that the authoritarians are using and the toolkit that the opposition activists are using, and then going into some case studies. So I thought it was very well structured, very easy. It is a call for action and warning, and it's very much a blueprint for action. So I did want to say that. Let me say, in answering that question, I'd answer a little bit slightly differently, and I'll tell you why. I do think that many of these authoritarians are learning from one another, but you know what? Given the ego involved in ruling and being a ruler, I highly doubt anyone would ever acknowledge that they're looking at what someone else is doing. As Peter was talking, I thought to myself, who's the person that really just jumps out in my mind? I happen to be an election observer in Venezuela when Hugo Chavez was running. By the way, that really caught my attention because he was running free and fair election after Carlos Andrés Pérez. And it was interesting to me, he won. There were many election observers there. His first term, he did a lot of things in country. It was the second term that really, really changed. And what did you see? Talking about a toolkit, using elections for legitimizing your position, which definitively he did. And you see this in other cases. Secondly was the rule of law. It was very striking to me, very important. By the way, you can have laws, but there are good laws and bad laws. And in this case, actually the laws were very much manipulated, including the judges and how they were appointed. So what you got, it seems like, oh yes, well we have these checks and balances, but not really. And that's part of a toolkit, and sure, as is addressed in this case. And then, you know, I will also say that a lot of these, when you look at them, these rising authoritarians, that they also are looking at something that has been a challenge for countries grappling with democracy and emerging democracies, and that's the issue of expectations. Because how do you match a transition with these high expectations? And it doesn't happen quickly, as we know. It takes time. And if you don't have a hands-on and active public communications strategy, you know, your public is going to, with time, mobilize against you for other reasons and look for unfortunate alternatives. But that's in this mix. And then also, which is very much addressed in the book, and I'm only mentioning a few of the highlights in this case, but also the corruption that then permeates the solidification of these power bases. So, Fred, to answer that question, I see it as yes, each are watching the other, but they also have their own sort of style in which they are advancing. What about the opposition activists? This is what I like about this particular product, because I do think it is, as I said, a warning and a call for action, particularly to policymakers, that look, these trends are occurring, and what are we doing? We need to be taking preventive action here. That's how I would call it. In other words, stepping up and taking and providing the kind of assistance that those in resistance are looking for. Peter, I think, made a very important point, and I'll wind up on this point almost. Peter made an important point, and that was that, you know, here you need to look at not only the skill sets, but also, even if you don't have a clear manifestation of that there is about to be civil resistance, but it's, you know, there underneath, that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. And let me give you a graphic recent case in point that really struck me, and that is in Russia. You know, with the killing of Nemtsov, you know, there was going to be a demonstration. And part of it also related, by the way, to Ukraine and his releasing information and a film relevant to Russian involvement in Ukraine. The interesting thing is, I think most who were speculating thought that the turnout was not going to be that, maybe several thousand, but because of his killing, the turnout was massive. Why is that significant? Because the message of the killing, in my view, was that no one is untouchable. Here you have, a former high-level official who, right near the Kremlin, is shot. No one is untouchable, but yet the massive turnout, of those who came to pay recognition. So in this case, I think that it's incumbent upon policymakers, our embassies, I like that, the military that's highlighted in here. There are some very practical things that policymakers can and should be doing to shore up the kind of assistance and help that those in opposition and civil resistance are desirous of and need. And that's a form of great preparedness here.
Thank you for that, Paul. Let me turn to Damon to round this out, and I'll go to the audience as quickly as I can. Pick up on what you've heard from others. I'm sure you have some general comments yourself. But within this, and then maybe I'll make this question also for the other two of you before I go to the audience, is democracy promotion, when I first came to the Atlantic Council 7 or 8 years, it just had a bad name. You saw the polling, where you had a falling number of voters that actually thought the U.S. ought to be involved in it. Some of that's shifted, but in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan, you didn't see U.S. voters and the U.S. government talking as openly about democracy promotion that might have been the fact during the Cold War in the past. So aside from whatever else you want to say in your opening comments, how does the U.S. government approach this democratic decline? And what is our role, U.S., our allies in Europe, especially the transatlantic thinker that you are, Damon, maybe get started on this, and I'll turn to Peter and Paul on that question as well afterwards.
So Fred, that's exactly where I sort of wanted to start, because I think that hits at the reason of why we're doing this project here at the Atlantic Council. Because the Atlantic Council community that was built on the backbone of countries and allies that came together with shared values of democratic institutions, rule of law, civil society, we have found ourselves backing away from the norms that we helped create and hands off in a way that that we've lost a sense that we actually have an ability to have impact, efficacy as policymakers, or that it's even the right thing to do because of our overlearning of some lessons of Iraq. In many respects, I came to this after having been in the U.S. government dealing with Rose Revolution that took us by surprise, an Orange Revolution that failed and prompted counter-revolutions, and the scars of Iraq. And coming here at the Atlantic Council, and here, part of when we first began the conversations with Peter, part of what we thought was important is that the issue, the role that democracy plays in U.S. national security needs to be something that is mainstreamed and bipartisan. And in fact, at this time, as Fred, you well remember, part of the whole impetus, the Atlantic Council began two things. We started actually presenting an annual Freedom Award to those that had really stood up to put at risk and fight for democracy and freedom, presenting these awards first in Berlin, but now in Poland, to basically mainstream that sense that freedom and this idea of democracy is not a negative. It is actually quite powerful force in other societies, as has been as our own. And then compelled by our conversations of actually getting to know the research that Maria and Erica and Peter have been involved in, that this was an untold story for policymakers who were struggling with what to do. And that you could see the empirical case on nonviolent civil resistance showing that it was a more effective at transforming authoritarian states than violence was, 2 times more effective at that type of change, 10 times more effective at actually leading to democratic transitions over time. These were powerful stories, and so this whole effort is exactly where Paula was. How do we actually begin to explore the policy implications of much of the research that had been building in this space? Because you were in frustrating conversations as Syria was unfolding, as other issues were unfolding, that you could either do nothing or you go to war. or that our only option to intervene is once we have a massive humanitarian catastrophe in Libya, and then we've constructed a rationale to use military force to get involved, when don't you want to avoid that situation in the first place? And so the honest grasping of policymakers for what to do is where we wanted to target this entire effort, because it seems like there's a lack of tools available, an understanding of what the research can lead to, both understanding the efficacy and that you've got an ability to have some impact here. And I think that's what the gap that we've been trying to bridge through this process, through some really painful lessons. And on the one hand, you can look at this and say, we've actually been winning on a normative front. If you're a dictator today, you have to pretend to play by our rules. You have to pretend to play by the democratic rules, just as Paula was outlining. Chris Walker had the great op-ed in the Washington Post on the zombie democracies this week. It's a great body of work. We've won that normative case that you have to fake it to have any sense of legitimacy. The problem is we're losing on the strategy about what to do in response to this. We're passive about that. We're almost self-censoring about this, that we can't get involved because we're so traumatized by Iraq. And on top of that, now we see the authoritarians, not just on comeback, going on offense, penetrating our institutions, manipulating our institutions, whether they're of allies or the UN Human Rights Council, and the counteroffensive to these colored revolutions. So I think what we're trying to hit at is, can we take this work that folks have been doing, incredible work, you see this among the activists, the civil society actors, and the researchers and the academics. Can we bridge this gap into the mainstream policy discussion here in Washington? First of all, we need to be playing defense to protect the integrity of our own institutions, but we also need to think about offense, but in the right way. Offense of how do you support what are indigenous peaceful movements about shaping their own future, having more options and a more democratic future for them, so that we don't find ourselves waiting for that humanitarian catastrophe until the newsreels force us to figure out how to come up with a legal justification to act. And I think that's where we want to drill back into the basics. Shouldn't democracy be a core element of our national security strategy? And people don't tend to think of it that way. But if you're thinking about selfishly our U.S. national security interests, the nature of the regimes that we're dealing with have a direct impact on their behavior internationally. Think Russia, think Venezuela. Think about these issues, how much different our interest in foreign policy would be if we had democracies in many of these challenging places. And so without getting bogged down and shutting down the discussion, Iraq regime change, how do you open up an honest intellectual conversation about the tough issues? You find the right options and tools that aren't about us imposing on others, but this is about how can you begin to create this idea that it's maybe legitimate for forces, whether they're non-state actors or even whether they're governments, to begin to provide cross-border civilian assistance to nonviolent democratic movements. And I think that's where we have let the traumas that we've gone through shut down our debate prematurely, close off the options available to you if you're sitting in the White House today. And that's not smart either for our national security interests or from a moral imperative. And I think that's what we're trying to break through this project.
So I want to go, we don't have that much time left. I want to go to a couple of questions. But Paula, can you, since you've been in government, since you've had these jobs, how does the U.S. government approach in this context, which is different in the world, these questions of democratic decline in a way that is not counterproductive, because we've got a mixed results from these
Absolutely.
efforts. Yeah.
Something that I think the points I'm about to mention, all of them are within this book. First is, most importantly, is that as you advance democracy, you can't just take our model and, as we put it, transplant it on the soil of another country. It just doesn't work that way, and it's not going to work. It's going to be counterproductive. And so starting with that. Secondly is Larry Diamond, if you look at his chapter, he talks about people power. And he also talks about in his chapter how crucial it is that those on the outside are not selecting and choosing who the leaders should be. I really relate to this because he's talking about bottom-up approaches. That's what's really important here, bottom-up approaches, not top-down approaches. Thirdly, the moral narrative, and that's what we just heard Damon speak to. The moral narrative is absolutely important the embracement of those values that we hold so dearly, and not just only because they're good, but also because, as he pointed out, they relate to security. They are the mainstay of security and stability. That is the glue that has really worked in keeping peace for decades. And finally, Fred, I'd say we have to also keep in mind a practical approach, and you know what that is? The process is never linear. And as we've seen in the Middle East, other places, there are setbacks. Does that mean that it's a crisis situation? In my view, no. One thing I liked very much about this book, although the answer was yes about the authoritarians, read deep, it talks about, hey, it's not foolproof. Hey, are you looking at the next generation, the students, and the impact that they have? And we have to have a sense of perspective. There are going to be setbacks, but the setbacks are opportunities to also learn from and march forward.
Something quick on this, or I go to the audience? Great. Questions, please. Hans. And for the recording.
Hans Binnendijk
yeah.
from SICE. Yeah. Damon raised the really good point that especially in Europe, but elsewhere, democracies are on the defensive, and in part they're on the defensive because authoritarians are becoming very good at putting them on the defensive. And we see this worldwide, but we see it particularly in Europe now. And so I really have a question for Peter, building on that. Peter, given the work that you have done on the other side of this, which is using all of these strategies and techniques that you've been working on to have regime change, what can you tell us about the other side of the coin, building resilience in these countries that are being targeted? How do you use civil society? How do you use some of the stuff that Denny Blair's been writing about? How do you use those techniques to strengthen societies and democracies that are now under attack?
Yeah, and I think if others want to chime in on this as well, because there's two sides of the story, and we've really only talked about one, which is authoritarian comeback. What we haven't talked about is democratic breakdown. So maybe
Democratic
breakdown of democratic breakdowns in strategically important countries. I mean, that's also happening.
Well, usually the breakdown comes because somebody leans on it. And so you can point to people who put pressure on a democracy, who take things from a democracy, people's rights, people's property, people's whatever people values. But I think you build, and maybe our work is not as strong on this in this sense of how do you basically deal with the idea of creating the resilience against authoritarian blowback. And then you get, I think, a little bit more back into the traditional post-democracy promotion idea that we have to build resilient institutions. And that's not really what I do, but that's very, very important, what we do. Because, building institutions that basically can adjudicate fairly on a variety of issues, that there isn't corruption, that sort of thing. But you need space to do that. And that space sometimes has to be battled for, and that's really where our focus is. So the key to civil resistance is creating that space and protecting against authoritarian capture of that space. Once that's done, and if it's secure, then it's fair to assume, as was the case, in 10, 15 years after the end of the Cold War, is that institutions can develop and thrive. So I still see it as a battle to defend that space.
One more question, please. Let's take these last two questions for this panel, right here and here. Yeah, here we go.
Hello, Eleanor Bachrach. You talk about that democracy should be a core element of our national security strategy, but the fact is that the core element in many cases has been our support for authoritarian regimes such as Saudi Arabia. So how do you reconcile that?
And one more question, please.
Elizabeth Wilson, Seton Hall University. I'm one of the contributors. And I just wanted to make a point that I did the chapter on the international law, and as I did some further research, I came to realize that there are also drivers of the authoritarian comeback that are coming from democratic and legitimate international institutions like the UN Counterterrorism Committee and the Financial Action Task Force, which is pressuring a lot of countries to adopt very restrictive laws on civil society organizations. So there's another kind of tool that could be used to make sure that, you know, global governance organizations, institutions that are under the sway of pro-democratic forces actually are doing or furthering the right agenda.
So who would like to comment? Yeah,
Sure.
please. So maybe 1 minute of each of you on these final two questions, please.
I just pick up quickly a couple of those points that, to link them all together from Hans back. First, I think it also means corruption as a national security issue. So how we think about combating corruption as a national security issue in terms of that building the resilience. It also means, and this is your space, Hans, we have this big debate over hybrid war right now. And so we find many of these countries wanting to talk about, oh, we need a new strategy for hybrid war, but they don't actually have the political and strategic wherewithal to say, Vladimir Putin is waging a war against our society. And if you can't actually say that with clarity at a political level, then your murkiness, you're walking around talking about strategy against what, for what purpose. We're already letting them, if we can't speak with clarity about the challenge we face, we're already letting that strategy on the authoritarian side work. And then I think in terms of democracy as a national security strategy, I think it's a recognition that over the long term, our fundamental interests are better served when we're able to work with more with democracies around the world. I don't think it means you move into a black and white, we have to have, this is the only way we can operate and the only countries we will work with. But it does mean that there is a principled focus and determined part to include that element as your national security strategy to support those indigenous voices where possible, to raise these issues as part of what we're doing in a sustained, consistent, and even to some degree predictable way with a view towards how we're actually thinking about this over the long term, recognizing we still don't control many of those levers. We're looking for where those opportunities are developing in other societies.
I'd add, and sort of going to your question and picking off what you just said, 3 points. One, you know, the strongest foreign policies are those that are able to balance what constitutes idealism with realism. And sometimes it is the toughest thing to do because every case is different and you might have a higher percentage of one over another. But at the same time, I also think, secondly, it's very important to speak out. I don't know if you recall or you know, but actually, interestingly enough, during the Bush administration, when President Bush spoke before the National Endowment for Democracy, he gave a speech in which he talked directly to the issue of human rights in Saudi Arabia. And I remember that very moment. I was in the audience when he uttered those words, and I think there was, people really took note of it. Thirdly, I think of another place. During the Afghan war, there are a number of countries in the stands. And in terms of access in, there was quite a big debate about whether or not you should partner or not partner. There were certain realities that were incumbent upon us to be effective and in which we pursued those avenues. But at the same time, by the way, those avenues also opened up doors that hadn't existed in terms of actually laying down our concerns about human rights issues. Did it have some effect? Some. But again, it's not perfect, but it goes back to my point. You have to look in terms of foreign policy. The combination of idealism and realism, is it always a perfect match? Is it always consistent? I won't be the first to tell you, no, it's not always consistent. And you have to look at the broad picture.
I think I'd agree with that entirely, and there's too many situations, too many contexts to basically generalize. But if we focus on the areas where we're really at threat, which I think is really in Russia and really in Iran right now, and maybe even China down the road, we have a great stake in the promotion of civil resistance. I mean, it's an unalloyed interest in making civil society stronger than the elements that basically are in control in Russia and in control in Iran now. There, I don't think there's much ambiguity. This is a tool. We have to be thinking about this as part of the overall strategic concept that we have in dealing with these people. And we have a conceptual exclusion to considering that for a variety of reasons I've suggested over time that really is not healthy and good for our foreign policy. But your point's correct, that it's very hard to be consistent under all circumstances in all countries. But there's too, that we can do a lot to basically advance our interests if we think clearly about those possibilities.
Thank you very much. Let me close this panel, first of all, with thanking three really tremendous experts in this field. We're a bipartisan organization. The Atlantic Council, and as a council, we've got far too many members, far too many board members to ever take a single view of the Atlantic Council on any issue. But we want to do the debate. And we can, as we see that democracy is in decline, and there's no denying that, you really have to ask yourself why and what sort of national security consequences there are there, and then take a nuanced, really interesting view of what we do about it. And I think that's what this book really does, and I want to salute the authors as we move on to their panel. Brent Scowcroft, chairman of our International Advisory Board, calls himself an enlightened realist. There are some countries that are not entirely democratic by our American measure, but the rulers have a significant measure of legitimacy and don't oppress in order to keep people in line. There are other non-democratic countries that are on the balance in a far different place. And so I think Paul is absolutely right that I think we have to, it's very hard to be consistent in these issues, but I think as an enlightened realist, or an idealo-realist, as I like to call myself, you can't take a look at this world without a set of ideals where you see that our ideals are in danger. So I think this is really a great book, a great contribution. I want to thank every of the panels, and particularly Peter, for inspiring this effort.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stay in your seats. The next panel will begin immediately. We are not taking a break right now, so stand back.
Okay. Okay, I want to start the second panel and thank everybody for their patience as we get started. This panel, we're going to really feature the book and get down into some of the issues in the articles. And we have 3 of the contributors here. We do have a number of the other contributors around in the audience. So I'd encourage you after this panel, we get out in the reception that you talk to actually the other contributors as well. All of them really did yeoman work. I mean, this was actually a bigger production than we thought when we started, which I think turned out to be a much better production. But everybody was really very helpful, patient, and we had a number of editorial changes and rewrites that we asked for, the usual thing when you're putting together an edited book. We want to feature here 3 of the contributors. So directly to my right is Regine Spector, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and was the author of the case study on Central Asia. Next over is Dennis Blair, who used to be my boss at the National Intelligence Council and the DNI, who's now head of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and did, as mentioned already, the article on military involvement and actually as a tool for getting democracy in other countries. And then George Lopez, last one on before Maria, Vice President of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and he did the article on smart sanctions. And finally, everybody knows Maria at the end, and she will actually moderate the discussion here among the contributors. What I wanted before we get into that, and this is just two sentences here, just telling you that this is only the first part. As we talked a lot about, you know, the original ideas to really get in the policy side, and we have second part where Maria and I will be again doing a monograph, but also be doing a lot of other activities on this theme of responsibility and right to assist and what the tools are. So you haven't heard The Last of Us. We're going to be out there actually involving you again in a lot of these activities and really enlarging the effort, particularly less on the analytic side, much more on the policy side. And I think this is very important, leading as we are into a presidential campaign where, as we've talked about here, it's very important to get this message about the importance and the responsibility to assist civil resistance elsewhere right into the policy, and the policy that the campaigns will be beginning to develop for the different candidates, but also to get that into the psyche of this election cycle. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maria.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Matt. And maybe on your first point, just so people know who the other contributors to the book are, could the other authors just stand up so that folks during the reception know who you are? There are a number of you here. Great. Okay. Fantastic. Bravo. So feel free to approach them for a question during the reception. Maybe just back to a point from the earlier panel about who's outlearning the other. Are authoritarians outlearning civil society and activists, or is it the other way around? I actually think it's a great question, and I don't actually know the answer to the question. I think one data point to note, Fred and Peter mentioned my work with Erica Chenoweth on civil resistance and which form of resistance, violent or nonviolent, has historically been more effective, even against repressive dictatorial regimes. And the main finding of the book is that nonviolent resistance has been twice as effective historically as armed struggle, even against these tough opponents. But our data covered the period of 1900 to 2006 in the book. And of course, Erica Chenoweth and her team in Denver have updated the data from 2006 to present. And one pretty troubling, worrisome finding is that the success rate of nonviolent campaigns and movements during the first few years of this decade has declined to a rate we have not seen since the 1950s.
So we don't know at this point. It's too early to call if this is a durable trend, but it's certainly worrisome, and it gets at the question of clearly regimes and governments do seem to be learning from each other. Erica's great chapter in the book, by the way, is called The Dictator's Handbook. So she goes through 12 key attributes of what dictators are doing across the board in various countries around the world to crack down on civil society and suppress nonviolent campaigns and movements. So I encourage that to you. But in any event, it's worrisome. There is an element of authoritarian resilience around the world, and it's something that we have to be able to address politically, strategically, and then operationally with the toolkit that Matt mentioned, which will be the focus of the second book that we do together. So on this point of authoritarian resilience, first of all, I'm thrilled to be on the stage with 3 of our authors. It's great being with you and seeing the book in print, of course. Regine Spector from UMass wrote an excellent chapter on authoritarian resilience in Central Asia. So her main finding in that chapter is that the relative resilience of Central Asian regimes is due to what you call adaptable autocrats. And you outlined 5 pillars of authoritarian resilience. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what these 5 pillars are and how they relate to some of the cases that you discussed?
Great. Thank you, Maria, and thank you to Matt. It's a real honor to be here today and to be more broadly part of this project. So Central Asia provides a really interesting lens through which to analyze authoritarian countries and authoritarian resilience. Some people have said that these countries are ripe for revolution following the Arab Spring. Others have said they're firmly entrenched in their Soviet legacies of the past. And what I do in the chapter is I really try to show how it's important to look at these leaders and these regimes as adapting, as we've been talking about for the last hour. And building along the lines of other research on the Middle East and other parts of the world, we see these authoritarian leaders as adapting. The one exception that I'll just footnote is Kyrgyzstan. So for those of you who know Central Asia, you know that Kyrgyzstan has experienced 2 regime changes since independence in 2005 and 2010. I think it's a really interesting case because it defies some of the conventional ways we think about regime change. In that particular case, it was in fact wealthy elites who mobilized the local population to preserve their own interests in government and in economic spheres. So while it wasn't a bottom-up civil resistance that we've been talking about, I think it's a really important case because what followed was in fact worse for 5 years, but what followed after that, after 2010, was an opening that while the country is nominally democratic, there are still challenges, it provided space that we've been talking about for institutional reform, for different actors to mobilize and play a prominent role in society. So I think that that is an instructive case in and of itself. But to get to this question of resilience, the 5 pillars that I talk about, I start with repression and violence. And I think it's really important. There are many people who know a lot more about this than I do in this room, but I think it's really important to understand this and to understand that there are big variations within these regimes. And you see this in Central Asia. Uzbekistan has a long history of state-sponsored violence and repression. They've had their own version of the Tiananmen moment in 2005 with masses of people gunned down in the central square in Andijan. And on the other hand, you have regimes such as Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan that, yes, have used violence, but much more selectively. Violence in the form of disappearance and imprisonment are very common, so often maybe not as visible, but very important strategic elements of the regime. I think to get maybe to the policy prescriptive elements, thinking about what the norms of violence are in each of these societies is really important because they're very different. The second pillar of authoritarian resilience is the ability of the regime to appropriate economic flows. So what's really interesting about all these regimes, not only in Central Asia, but China and Russia, as we've been talking about, is they are tied to the global economy, whether it's through foreign direct investment, remittance flows from migrant laborers, drug trafficking and human trafficking, they're integrated. And so thinking and understanding how they open these valves, how they strategically mobilize these investments, whether it's to empower their own wealthy, their own cohort, or to actually provide social services to the population, which some regimes have increasingly started to do. I think those are really important trends to understand. And again, they do this in different ways depending on the type of commodity and the type of flow. But this is a really important component, I think, of their resilience, which is to appropriate and use these economic resources that result from globalization strategically. The third pillar that I talk about is the ability to control political institutions and direct politics, and this has been mentioned in the previous panel, whether it's the elections, the parties, the role of the media. I think what you're seeing is variations on the ways in which they use these nominally democratic institutions to their own ends. So while some formal institutional spaces are closing, for example, certain parties are banned or outlawed, you do see variations. So Kyrgyzstan is a great example, which I'll come back to in a minute. The fourth pillar is, and this is, I think, often understudied in general, which is the general culture of compliance in society. I think these regimes, some of them, are incredibly sophisticated at defining the political agenda and managing media flows in a way that doesn't close out space, but rather, and doesn't discredit the press entirely, but reframes the debate entirely. So let me just give you an example from Kazakhstan. The leadership there sets the political agenda by managing and manipulating political drama. They create political drama, so it looks like there's competition or it looks like there's debates. And they employ rhetoric surrounding democratization that suggests that there is a debate here, there's politics. But what's really going on is the government is reframing what democratization means in the interest of preventing fragmentation and strengthening the presidential party. And for regimes in Central Asia, what happened in Tajikistan and what's going on in Afghanistan are true threats in their mind. And so they reframe the debate among society, and I think in ways that serve to create resilience and to create support for those regimes among local people. And the fifth pillar is the managing of foreign influence. Again, there are many different themes we could talk about, but there's been a lot written about the role of laws banning non-governmental organizations from working in these areas. There is extreme variation on this, with Uzbekistan being the most autarkic and strict in this regard, especially after Andijan in 2005. But you have countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan that are incredibly open to foreign non-governmental organizations, to foreign workers, to different ideas. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind, again, that the stands are not all unique, or that are not the same, and there are very unique features to each one of them.
So given the divergences in the types of resilience and how they manage their resilience, what would be your advice to policymakers then who are seeking using various means and tools to support democratic development in this difficult region?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important question. And I look forward to the second part of this project to dive into that. Here's what I would say to that. On the one hand, the first point is that these regimes are very different, and so we need to take that into consideration. But more than that, I think the first thing we can do, and I think this is a continuation of what was said on the last panel, is we can listen to those in the region. We can listen very carefully to everyday people and people on the ground confronting these challenges on a day-to-day basis. It may seem simple and it may seem obvious, but why do I stress this first? And the answer is because I think, and again, there are people here who know more about the history of democracy promotion and its evolution, what some funders may support may not be what people on the ground want or need. And it may be what they want, but it also may be what is not, from their perspective, politically feasible or palatable at the moment. So I think at the broadest level, we should listen to what they want. They may not describe what they want in terms of democratization, but in terms of opportunities, freedoms, rights. And I think we should take that very seriously, because that is, in fact, where I think space can be opened. The second thing is, I would say, even though we're not seeing, let's say, collective action or mass protests, doesn't mean that resistance isn't there, and this is, again, a very common point, I think, in the resistance literature. I think we should look very closely at what is going on and to look in unexpected places for opportunities. So my own work focuses, in addition, on political economy and what everyday people are doing to survive in the context of weak rule of law institutions and corruption that was mentioned. Traders in Zimbabwe, from Zimbabwe to Kazakhstan, are confronting a very authoritarian, oppressive state when it comes to trade and bazaars, for example. Many spaces have been eliminated, but instead of seeing the absence of collective response to these very difficult conditions, I think it's really important to look at how they adapt as forms of resistance, and that there are possibilities that they engage in that might not be collective, but that definitely are political in their minds, that definitely mean that there are potentials for, let's say, labor unions or trade unions or different types of movements to emerge. And we've seen that in Kyrgyzstan, for example, independent trade unions for the first time. We've seen movements around political parties that are trying to work with migrant remittances. And those are the spaces, I think, that we should really be looking in. They're not necessarily traditional to the resistance literature, but I think they exist on the ground, and there are people on the ground who can, and who are interested in working along those lines. I think I'll stop there.
Great, that's super helpful. And I know there are some state and USAID people in the audience, and I think that's an important point about looking beyond the traditional actors, the traditional civil society, NGO, CSO, and widening the aperture a little bit when considering which groups to engage to support, because change is oftentimes, as we all know, driven by diffuse, decentralized movements, which are comprised of non-traditional civil society actors. So unless you have already developed somewhat of a Rolodex of these individuals and leaders, it's going to be hard to even know about change happening, much less figure out how to support and be in a secondary support role. So thanks very much for those comments, Regine. Actually going to turn to George Lopez, my USIP colleague, next. George wrote a great chapter about smart sanctions in the book, which builds on his previous life, where he focused a lot more on the role of international sanctions. And you wrote, one of your concluding points was that the extension of smart sanctions against dictatorships for the abuses of power beyond human rights could actually be effective at shaping behavior. So maybe you could explain just how that would look in practice.
Okay, thank you, Maria, and thanks everyone here at Atlantic Council, Peter and others, for not only this forum, but I was especially thrilled to be asked to be a contributor. Sanctions, of course, over the last 25 years have a mixed record, and despite the title of the chapter in the book, sanctions, in fact, have never by themselves brought down a dictatorship. But the optimism of this chapter, and my hope in this, is that this particular tool, and Peter and others called for tools and their strict application, has been underused. And here's the way I think. I mean, the first is the thinking about what contest is going on between the possibility for nonviolent resistance or resistance of any type and the maintenance of power and repression by the dictatorship. One way of thinking about this is that however strong a dictatorship is, it is strong at a top of a pyramid, but it derives most of its longevity from the elites and others who derive some benefits from that illicit system because they're either part of the corruption and criminal nexus which sustains it, or if they're not, they find economic, political, and other benefits. The benefits in this world of the now 2010s can't be sustained within that particular system. Those benefits often derive from international linkages and contexts, and particularly of an economic form. That means that outside actors, people outside the struggle between the repressed or resistors and the dictatorship, now have new leverage points, particularly in the economic interaction, particularly in a world of very mobile financial and other goods, to be able to constrain, hold back, or in fact, not only constrain and roll back, but begin to extend the reach of these tools, which we call smart and targeted sanctions, against individuals, entities, and maybe even processes. That is, the process by which whether or not a bank could use a SWIFT system to maintain its MasterCard and Visa system. My contention in the chapter is that we've not done, on the social science or policy side, enough analysis and use of these tools in a way that would target not only the thin layer of the dictatorship, but this broader upper middle sector of what I would call the internal enablers. And we haven't done the analysis that links the internal enablers with the external enablers. Let me give a couple of examples. The financial, are, if you will, the lowest hanging fruit. At its best, for example, a U.S. Department of Treasury could impose sanctions on human rights violators of the kind that have just recently been imposed against 7 individuals in Venezuela. I wonder if this is a prototype. I've tried to talk in depth with some Treasury people. We haven't gotten so very far yet. But it's different than what we tried, for example, in Syria and Libya, when we saw repression begin to take hold. We could go after big entity targets, but we didn't exactly get the people by name and bank account at the start the way we've been able to do in Venezuela. Secondly, as you all know in this room, you don't have to dig very deep to see a dictatorship tied to corruption and various illicit networks of transfer, and whether those illicit networks of transfer are based in fraudulent insurance companies or holding and shipping companies or banks or shadow companies in the transportation sector. It's relatively easy with the help of not only the U.S. government, but Interpol, International Maritime Organization, and others, to be able to identify where the choke points might be on these. A concentrated application in this in the finance and trade movement area has not been tried for solely the purpose of either protecting civilian resistance or trying to, I'd say it outright, punish and constrain dictatorship from the increased use of Hart's technique. Second level, I look at my colleague and friend in the back, who's head of our Peace Tech Lab, Sheldon Himmelfarb. Technology. We know at its worst what repression has done in many countries has been able to tap into the cell phone networks, the text messages, and the others of civil resistors, and been able to counter in a direct way the freedom of association and the other things that make for strong nonviolent movement. Where do those chips and technology that sustain that system in the repressive regime come from? They're not homegrown. They're traded in a network that can begin anywhere from Europe to Southeast Asia to South Africa and onward. How to control that network, how to expressly put on a constrained list of goods when repression begins a set of material that enhance the technological abilities of a repressor to go after either the innocent or the mobilizers is an important responsibility of government. That's how you deal with the enablers. In the old days, which is only about a decade ago, we thought by freezing the bank accounts and passports and visa systems of those at the top of the elite, we were taking a kind of bite of the personal because of their activity in the political arena. And that kind of harsh treatment would somehow get dictatorships to rethink. I think what we're looking at in not the comeback of authoritarianism, but rather the reinstitutionalization of authoritarianism, is that this system runs deeper. It sits on certain legs and pillars, and some of our authors have dealt with that. You've got to go after the pillars, and that's what my approach is here. It derives from the notion that crime and corruption is a bolstering part of the regime, that external enablers and networks of finance, technology, and transportation, insurance, and banking underscore this, and you can cut those linkages and penalize those who are either overtly engaged in the repression or at critical points in their society, as bystanders say, we have no connection, we do nothing. Many of us know a reality of good democratic life. With enough suspicion, you might be arrested and charged for the crime, but released on bail, and you have your ability to make your day in court. I know I scare some Treasury officials in this town, and even people in the international sanctions movement, when I say we could impose a 30-day sanction on certain kinds of individuals under suspicion of being associated with repression until we can accumulate the evidence to guarantee that they're not. Sanctions and their development over time have demanded too much corpora delicti, which in our cases of what we're worried about is too many bodies in the street before you say this is someone who should be targeted. I think a more aggressive approach on particularly abhorrent regimes can go after folks who then can have their day in court after they've had their assets frozen, after they've had the technology that they import constrained for 30 days until we can do the investigation and see whether or not they are in fact bystanders who are helping this particular aspect of life. And lastly, because sanctions are only a tool and a means, you can't have sanctions work in the absence of a larger political element of this political economy tool, in the absence of a strategy. Why do you constrain technology, finance, et cetera? What's the bargaining dynamic you're trying to set up either between these outsiders who impose and the insiders or the targets? What bargaining dynamic can we enforce from the movements for democratic change and civil resistance on the ground and the particular regime? This, I think, was part of the elongated but still reasonably successful situation in South Africa. The fact that the unions, the churches, and civil society organizations in South Africa said, look, yeah, do we feel a bite from the sanctions? You bet. But the fact that that international solidarity and real constraint of resources puts the government in a situation in which they have to deal with us face-to-face, that's very, very helpful. We need to think back to that case, but modernize it in terms of the finances, technologies, and other aspects of this. And I guess my really last point is I'm delighted to see the movement where this is going to go, which is the responsibility to assist. Because the responsibility of assist raises the flip side of sanctions, the incentives. The possibility where you're on the one hand constraining groups that are repressors, and on the other hand providing inducements, assistance, and other kinds of activities to those who espouse nonviolent, democratic dialogue for constructive change. And I think this gets us back to that political element. In the absence of a political strategy that looks not only at coercion and constraints, but also looks at inducements, that's the collective strategy that may work and that we have to operationalize in the future.
Great. Thanks, George. That's very helpful, and I think we'll be recruiting you for the policy phase of the project as well. Maybe one point, since this is a crowd that's very interested in Russia, what would be your assessment of the sanctions regime currently targeting the Putin regime?
Well, I know the question often in this town is, well, I mean, Putin hasn't cried uncle and he's not capitulating. In my framework, that's not the issue. I don't care about what Putin does. What I care about is all the people who support Putin and whether or not they're feeling an economic pinch that increases the costs of their tacit or direct support for policy that we know is abhorrent and illegal. And at some point, that's going to happen. We're not very deep into this as sanctions go. The average success of even targeted sanctions is about 21 months. We're not there yet. The ruble change and various other things say the economy is beginning and these elites are beginning to scream uncle. I worry about the political economy of this. What's the set of choices we've placed before those elites with regard to options under these conditions to say yes to the Minsk agreements, to say yes to another alternative, to say yes to a reduction in sanctions for particular kinds of withdrawal from eastern Ukraine under certain conditions. You've got to do that quid pro quo, which maximizes the economic pain with the political gain that you'd like. And I think we're lacking in that latter part.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thanks so much, George. So finally, Dennis Blair, who's written a great chapter in the book about the role that militaries can play in influencing attitudes and behaviors of militaries in non-democracies, and is also the leading author of the Military Engagement Guide, which I used to carry around with me along with the Diplomat's Handbook for Democracy Development Support, but then I discovered that it was really heavy with both of them together. So as a civilian, I opted for the Diplomat's Handbook, but needless to say, it's a really important handbook for all of us to take a read. So your main point, Dennis, which is so useful and insightful for this project, is that you write about various opportunities, and more than we think, that armed forces of established democracies have to influence the thinking and behavior of their counterparts in authoritarian regimes. So what would you describe as some of the main opportunities that security forces have?
Yeah, before answering that one, Maria, let me just say one thing that was sparked by the previous panel's discussion. You know, this 7 years of setbacks for democracy has one silver lining. At least we've escaped the communist dilemma. You know the communist dilemma? the proletariat is inevitably going to rule the world, so just sit back and enjoy it until it happens. You don't have to do anything. Well, I think there was a period there, 10 years ago when we thought democracy is just, sweeping the world. Everybody sees it's the right thing. All we have to do is just hum a little background music, and I think now we're realizing this is hard work. It's not going to happen on its own. It is, in fact, a contest of skills and dedication and values and so on. I think we have all the values and the good side, but that's not going to happen automatically. So fight's on. Let's go. Right? So that was kind of my reaction to that. But on the military side, I think the most important thing that I tried to get across to people is that this idea that somehow military forces and dictatorships go together naturally, and they just, generals love dictators, dictators love generals, they're going to support them to the end, it's just wrong. And in fact, the relationship between the armed forces and a dictatorship is in fact is under great strain, is fragile. The dictators don't trust their military forces because these are potential people who can knock them off. They have the guns. Sometimes they have the prestige if they won a war, if they've been successful in some military campaign. So from the dictator's point of view, the armed forces are, in fact, as much a threat as they are a support. And they use various techniques to try to be able to control them. On the other hand, from the other point of view, from looking up from the military point of view, there is often dictatorships become corrupt. They do terrible things. People who join the armed forces, some of them, a lot of them, come in with a sort of a patriotic idealist situation. They've quickly become disenchanted with what they see above them, both the dictatorship itself and the often corrupt senior officer corps that is somehow thrown in its slot with the dictatorship. You go far enough down any military hierarchy in a corrupt dictatorship organization, you find people who are angry about it and who want to change it. So on both sides, there's a lot of tension in this relationship. So that gives, I think, the democracies a lot of material to work with, to try to break that link, to try to wean the military support away from democracy. And the way you basically do it is you say, hey, you're loyal to the country. Of course you're loyal to the country, but you're not loyal to the person, the party, the group of thugs who happen to be in charge right now. Your greater loyalty is to your country. And then the trump card, I think, that you almost always have in dealing with military organizations and dictatorships is this point that at some point they're going to be ordered to turn their guns on their own people. And that really is not what people join the armed forces to do in any country. And you've seen in country after country armed forces trying to get away from that. Let the police do it, get rid of the dictator, all sorts of ways to do that. So I think the point one is to understand this tension and these breakpoints between the authoritarian governments and the armed forces. Then, to get to Maria's question, it turns out that across the democracies of the world, we have thousands of points of contact with officers and soldiers and sailors at all ranks in these organizations, in these authoritarian countries, some more, some less. In fact, it's really quite incredible what some dictatorships allow in terms of contact with their military forces. And you can walk in and say, well, here I am in dictatorship X, and I don't have a conversation with General so-and-so about what it's like in a democratic armed forces. You're better paid. You don't have to set up roadblocks to feed your family. Your retirement program is taken care of. You don't have to shoot your way into it, and you don't have to be corrupted into it. You have a much better deal if you changed here. So there's just plenty of points of contact, everything from senior officer visits down to the way that you exercise with them. There are tremendous points of contact, for instance, in peacekeeping or UN operations generally, when soldiers come out of their own countries, they serve elsewhere, their eyes can be widened. But again, it just doesn't happen automatically by itself. Sometimes it does. Sometimes military officers in autocratic countries put it together for themselves. But you can shove them. You can move them along. You can talk. And if you're in a uniform, they're in a uniform, you have a more effective way of doing it than if, frankly, they're being lectured by an NGO, long-haired, bearded, skinny, American who just showed up yesterday. So it's not to put any prototyping on the things, but and I should take that back. But you basically have lots of points of contact naturally set up, uniform to uniform, on people. But what is missing, I think, in the democracies in general, is charging the armed forces with that responsibility. If you look at what military organizations are told to do when they interact with authoritarian governments of various kinds, build interoperability, try to affect their policy, give them a better non-commissioned officer corps. Way down the list comes convincing them that it's a bad deal that they are currently following, and then there's a better deal that's available to them, which is in fact more loyal to their country than the ersatz loyalty to a person or an individual that they have. So that's kind of at the heart of it. And once you have that realization and that understanding of what you can work on, then there's just all sorts of things, from personal conversations to the way you set up exercises to the way you run educational exchanges in which you can reinforce this method and sort of this message in sort of a peer-to-peer way, and then sort of sit back and see what happens.
Great. So the point is, it has to start from a policy determination that this type of approach and strategy for essentially having armed force leadership be, Democrats when they go into societies as well,
right,
in addition. And that would take a leadership change before any of these operational elements of trainings and officer connections would need to happen. One question, though, I did have, and it's relevant because there are Syrians and Bahrainis in the audience, when it comes to military forces and security forces. So what if it's the case that the security forces are more loyal to a family or a sect than, for example, to a population and to a country? How does that influence the dynamics in these cases?
I think that's probably one of the two greatest obstacles and difficulties we have in the democracy promotion movement, because when there are fierce tribal, ethnic, religious divisions, very enlightened people will accept democratic principles right up to the point of extending them to another tribe, religious or other. And Francis Fukuyama, whom we all respect, has written about that in his book, in that patrimony, family comes first. The only way democracy can overcome that is by the development of really strong national institutions that will be trusted by the people to give up their favoritism to their own family, tribe, religion, in order to, with a feeling that it will be fair once they give up that power. So that's the really hard part. And I think particularly in African countries and Middle Eastern countries, we, in military relations, hit that very often. Now, the place that you should be able to take advantage of that is when you have minority groups who are prominent within the armed forces, the Alawites in Syria, the Sunnis in Iraq for so many years. And we should have been able to exploit that with the promise of a more equal distribution of power within the armed forces, passing out, making sure that when you choose generals, you choose a mixed balance that sort of reflects the ethnicity or the religious thing. That you don't build individual brigades that are just of one tribe or religion, because all you're doing there is training the best coup force for that tribe. And you can do that. And we tried to do it in Iraq, and then we left, and it fell apart, or it didn't fall apart. It was pushed apart as the government had that pro-Shia policy. Or you can try to talk to those who are at key moments in reorganizing their armed forces and help them realize that this is important if they are to have a national force which can, in fact, support the country and keep it together. So I think it's one of the big difficulties. There's a certain number of specific mechanical things you can do, but you've got to sort of keep working a problem.
I can say from just a pure sort of strategic civil resistance perspective, what this suggests in some of these cases where there's a strong ethnic, sectarian, religious identification with the military leadership, and that's the structure of the military, that targeting that pillar of support, at least initially, with your civil resistance is maybe not such a good idea. That there may be ways, if you create enough pressure by targeting the economic elites, political elites, and labor professional groups, and sort of leave the military to, to the end. But dealing with this as a, if you're an activist in a nonviolent struggle, and that's the structural reality that you're dealing with, I think this poses one of the greatest challenges, frankly, to nonviolent resistance in any of these societies.
I think that's right. I mean, in the research that I did, in my own experience, you will rarely find military leadership of a democratic change for the right reasons. You will often find, again, in the hijacking of democratic jargon, one armed thug will knock off another and say, I did it because of democracy, and then, falls in love with what he sees in the mirror and becomes the follow-on dictator. So they rarely lead honestly. But if you can sort of soften them up and get them thinking in the right way, if others lead, they will not stop it. And that's the problem, they can't stop it. I mean, you can stop things with guns for quite a while. And so you want to, at a minimum, get them to accept legitimate change when it comes, and maybe, as you said, not expect them to be out in the vanguard as the leaders of a true democratic reform. That is maybe a bridge too far for a hierarchical, top-down, disciplined organization.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dennis, and thanks to all the panelists for their initial remarks, and again for the great work that you did on the chapters for the book. So at this point, I think for the remainder of the time, we're going to turn it open to question and answer. So the mic should be passed around if folks have any questions for the panelists. Yes, Sheldon.
Thank you. This is a great book, and it's an important topic. But it feels to me as if a lot of the things the panel has been talking about are things that we have been talking about in this town for the better part of this decade, meaning it's got to be top-down and bottom-up. We need to be supporting civil society. I mean, we need to be figuring out how to have better sensing mechanisms within civil society in order to support the right influential networks. We need to be able to work military to military, and the financial sector is a critical piece of this puzzle. But so I feel as if we've been talking about these kinds of approaches, but that there's a lack of resources attached to it. That when you look at the dramatic disparity, for example, between a $500 billion defense budget and a $46 billion all of diplomacy and all of development combined, and a $35 million, if I might throw in, budget for our nation's Center for Conflict Management and Peace Building, the United States Institute of Peace, if you excuse the plug here. This is just such a dramatic disparity in resources. How do we get beyond that? How do we take the need for, the military has got a great saying, a vision without resources is a mirage. And it feels to me as if we've been sort of chasing a mirage in the discussion of supporting civil society and supporting some of these other initiatives without putting the resources into it. So I'd love to hear thoughts on the panel about how we should change that equation.
Well, I guess as the $500 billion representative, I should. How much do you spend on your car versus how much do you spend on your toothpaste? And is that proportionate if you want to take care of your teeth? I think these things about just sort of preparing raw figures and all are not helpful. I think what it really boils down in what is required first is the strategy and the understanding of what we're doing, and then you can match resources. To it. What basically, I think what you basically have to do to convince the American people that and their elected representatives that they should be spending more money on some of these things that we think are seriously underfunded is to have a coherent approach, which I think this book is a very key step in going towards. Because I agree with you that that these ideas have been around in disparate form for 10 years or so, but I don't think they've really been brought together as a coherent whole that can. It's always in terms of values versus interests, which doesn't get us very far. It's not in terms of here's really how to do it, which is what we begin to get here, there, and so if we can develop the way to do it, show a few successes, then I think we can get the right resources doing it. And it doesn't do any good to say take it away from here and put it here. What it does to say is this is what we have a goal. We've got to get more into it, and the subtractions will come from where the subtractions will come. I think that's much more effective in getting sort of official funding as well as other funding. So I do think that getting the ideas straight, getting the strategy straight, being able to talk about it, it's kind of like a parable. You have to have the simple explanation up here that works and is true, but then you have to have the gritty, here's no kidding how you do it when you get down to the lower level. And I think that's what this group is beginning to develop, so that when you just talk about promoting a democratic change around the world, you sort of overwhelm people with your competence and your having thought it all through, as well as just the beauty of your single idea, which will certainly get cheers, but you got to get that, you got to get those lower level, really effective things in order to get the real money.
And I would just say, I mean, I think one big difference between, say, support for armed insurgencies and support for nonviolent campaigns and movements is that there is no comparison. I mean, so relatively little in monetary terms is needed by nonviolent movements compared to armed insurgencies to achieve some of these goals that it's not, and we did a report about what it means to provide foreign aid more effectively to support movements. And what does it mean to have a movement mentality when you're a development practitioner? And we're not calling for $1 zillion more dollars. In this, it was a USIP special report. We're not calling for lots more money. We're calling for just a shift in an orientation and how you engage civil society and how you invest in peer-to-peer learning, which is probably at the end of the day more cost efficient and effective for activists and movements than just dumping money at them. There is a role for finances and resources for this in this field. But I think, I would agree with Dennis that starting with sort of the policy and the strategy push, and then making a case for if it's more resources based on a compelling narrative that frankly brings all of these tools together with an aim of supporting democratic development because it's in our national interest to do so and in international security interest to do so. So, did anyone else have a comment on that point before we, no?
I think why don't we pick up a few more of the...
Go ahead, Matt.
Please.
Hi, my name is Nada Al-Wadi and I'm a journalist from Bahrain. My question is for Mr. Blair. To what extent can foreign army forces actually play a role in enforcing democratic changes in a different society? I'm thinking about the cases of the Gulf region, obviously, where, of course, the military existence of, for example, the United States is very obvious and clear and very strong, actually, in the local political arena. So when there is a civil resistance going on in this particular societies, I'm thinking about Bahrain, for example, where there have been a movement for a nonviolent movement going on for years, to what extent there is a chance for that army forces that actually exist and play a role in the political situation there, to what extent it can play a role, actually? Is it actually a player at any situation that can change the reality. And I'm thinking about, of course, so many soldiers and people who actually live in these societies, engage in the day-to-day lives, see what is happening on the ground, but they can't really do anything because of the rules of the army forces, and maybe sometimes they are not. They are misinformed about the society. So anyways, just wanted to hear your perspective on this, and if there was any case in the history that an army forces was actually engaged in a political situation on a particular society. Thank you.
Did we want to take another question?
Yeah.
To
need some time to think about that one anyway.
Did you want to? Yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Patricia Wrightson. I'm wondering if the book addressed why this comeback may have occurred, and if the book has addressed that, if there might be some seeds to how to change things around by answering that question, why? I mean, why is authoritarianism staging a comeback? And does the answer to that contain some seeds for a pushback?
Okay. Dennis, have you had enough time to contemplate the first question? Bahrain.
Well, I would say you're asking about Bahrain in particular, and I think that the heavy American military presence in Bahrain, as you know, is just confined in a little enclave there with almost no contact with what's going on in the street. In fact, the Bahrainis want it that way in order to keep us isolated. The U.S. commanders want it that way so people won't get hurt and so on. So it's not really, I don't think many American soldiers and sailors in Bahrain know much about. They can go through a whole tour and not knowing anything about what goes there. I basically think we should get that Fifth Fleet headquarters out of Bahrain onto a ship where it could move around. I think that we think in a completely upside down direction about who has leverage in that situation. We somehow think that the Bahrainis have leverage because we have a headquarters there, rather than we have the leverage because we do have alternatives. So I think the one lever that we have, the presence of that big Fifth Fleet headquarters and all of the things, we don't take as much advantage of as we could in sort of directly telling the Bahrainis that unless you do some of the fundamental things that will heal some of these divisions in your society and allow these other groups more representation, more of a democratic role, we will leave. I think that's what we ought to do, and we should leave not only because it's wrong what's going on within the country, but because when it does inevitably blow up, as we found in other countries in which we've tried to maintain military forces, allowed ourselves to be allied with a repressive government. When things change, the new government doesn't think very well of the United States, and we don't have a very good long-term relationship. So that's kind of my feeling about Bahrain. And in other countries, you sort of have to work with what you have. I think the armed forces in Lebanon, if they could become more powerful, would be a better force for good in that country. They're just kind of a little. In Saudi Arabia, I mean, there's so much money there that they're able to buy their way out of almost anything, and that sort of overwhelms whatever you try to do politically or diplomatically other ways. So I think, to Regina's early point, there are many differences between the countries, but I think we ought to use the leverage that we have in countries that we can.
Regine, maybe you on why authoritarianism has made a comeback?
I've been thinking about that. So I'll provide some preliminary thoughts. I do think it's a question that's really important, that maybe deserves more sustained attention. I think that at least in the case of the Central Asian countries, what's really interesting about this region is that they've always been authoritarian since independence. So again, we have to distinguish between the countries that, for example, emerged out of independence or post-colonial situations which have continued to be independent over time. I think what we're seeing, though, is this other group of countries that started out maybe on some type of democratic trajectory or semi-democratic trajectory that have then what people have called backsliding, democratic backsliding. And so maybe I think that's that set of countries, so Russia is an example, and there are others, that maybe has captured the attention of certain groups and the literature, I would say more broadly. I think that one of the reasons that's really important, and this really comes from the political economy literature, but I think it's more broad. I think it can be applied to this context, which is that, again, in the context of new states, post-colonial states, post-socialist states, building effective states and markets is really, really challenging. And so what I mean by that is it is for some realms of society and the economy and state easier to control centrally than to create the institutions to govern, let's say, equally. So for example, with markets, it's easier to have one centralized marketing board than to create the institutions of a market economy that would allow many people to be empowered by that wealth. Or from the state building perspective, think about all that goes into creating functioning states, welfare states. You need a census, you need tax institutions, you need a whole host of government institutions to be able to extract wealth and redistribute it. And many of these states don't have that. And in fact, there's literature on how nationalization of companies is in part a response to challenges in state and market building. So those are some preliminary thoughts, and then you get into the ethnic and sectarian cleavages, which adds a whole other layer of challenge in terms of who's getting the wealth and how it's being distributed. So I think that's part of it. I think there's also the part of it that has to do with power and authority that is in many of these countries tied to the economy. I think it's a really important point that deserves more literature. I would just go back to the first panel, or more research. The first panel talked about authoritarian learning. I think that's really, really important too. And I actually think it's not something new per se. I think if you go back to 1991, and you look at what China was observing when the Soviet Union collapsed, they were intensely watching what was happening to that model and that system. And then if you go back, there are some people now working on the movements of the 1930s and the 1940s in Europe and their effects on, for example, Latin American coups and authoritarian regimes. And this is actually Kurt Whalen at Austin. So there are people now actually from the academic side who are looking at authoritarian learning and authoritarian resilience in historic perspective precisely to frame and to maybe be able to analyze what these trends of the last 7 to 10 years are in comparative historic perspective.
And I would also say flippantly that, of course, regimes pay attention when there are waves of popular movements. And right. So the prospect of a color revolution on your border in your country is frightening for a lot of non-democratic regimes. So they will ground in even more intensely to prevent something like that from happening. So sort of the demonstration effect. Do we have time for one more question? Or no, we're cutting off. So let's continue the conversation during reception. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you all for coming.